Isn't there that myth of the guy who falls in love with his own phallus? Or have I completely
Oh
made
my
that
word,
up?
I don't know about that one.
That is the thing, is it? There's a mythological origins and history of consciousness, I think. They talked about that.
I think you're probably confusing lots of things there, but
No. It's like the little vegetable boys who are obsessed with their own phalluses, and then when they go and meet the gods,
right. Well, Phallos is a god, certainly for some people.
Welcome back, everybody, to Jung To Live By. Absolute pleasure to see you here once again, and welcome back to our series, Ask a Depth Psychologist. This is episode 11 of this series, and if you've been keeping count, we started off by saying this would be once a month, and of course we started in January. It is now June, so 11, it doesn't really make any sense, because we're kind of doing them as and when we have the demand, and the demand is rising. We have about 20 questions in the bank, so we're going to bash these out as quickly as we possibly can, while still giving the questions as much depth that they actually deserve. So if you want to get involved in this, of course, you can subscribe at the $10 tier or higher on Patreon, and you can dump your questions in the hashtag Ask a Depth Psychologist channel on the Discord, and just sort of as and when they come up, as many questions as you want, within reason, please, and then we'll get to them as soon as we can. So thank you, everybody, for your patience, of course. We've got 3 questions today. The first one is all about mother complexes. Someone has watched our video on complexes that we did a few weeks back or so, and they're interested in the idea of the mother complex, negative mother complex, stuff like that. So that was a pretty good answer, I think. The next one is all about the parents. So there is this idea of bringing in Anthony Stevens to explain some stuff about the parents and unactualized potential being acted out through the child. It's kind of an interesting idea, and there's the idea of the Flying Dutchman that's associated with that too, so we want to get sort of a mythological motif in there too. So I think we gave some pretty good answers to that, or Steve and Pauline gave pretty good answers to that one, of course. And then for the final question, it's all about, again, Steve and Pauline's individuation marriage. It is a thing. It is an interesting thing, isn't it? It's like, what's the difference between that and a normal relationship? It's not an obvious thing. It's like what do you guys do all day? Just read each other's dreams. You know, that might be the impression one might get, or maybe there's a mystical quality to it. What is it that makes that different? Not necessarily better, but different to a normal relationship. So that's what we're going to find out today. But from now, I'm going to go back into the past and ask Steve and Pauline the first question. This question comes from Matt B, and he asks, I found the podcast on complexes really helpful. Based on what you've said, it's easy to see how a negative mother complex might disrupt the ability of a man, let's say, to relate with the world, since the relating factor by which he does so is so closely aligned with the mother complex, whether positive or negative. If I understand correctly, the problem in such a case, where the man's mother complex carries a negative charge, is essentially that his anima is not adequately differentiated from the complex of emotions associated with his mother, and so cannot be used properly to relate with the world. Negative elements of the mother complex always creep in and disrupt or discolour the relation. Jung says somewhere that this sort of projection can, quote, only be resolved when he sees that there exists in his psyche not only the image of the mother, but also of the daughter, the beloved, the chthonic baobo, if that's how you pronounce it, end quote. Something like that. I've grappled with this passage for a long time, but have never felt I adequately understand him here. What does he mean by this? Am I way off track? Many thanks, as always. What do you guys think?
Well, I don't think you're way off track at all, because you've just lifted pretty much directly what he has to say in that specific context. It's certainly true that the relating function can be shaped negatively or positively by experiences of the mother, for example, or indeed of any significant contributor to the development of your relating function. Yeah, so the mother complex can certainly intrude. The key thing to remember again about this is that the anima as relating function relates internally and externally. So everything that you encounter, whether it's an interpretation of the inner world or the outer world, passes through that. And then there's a relationship to the ego or the ego with respect to the relating function as well. So the state of the relating function as the anima complex, for example, overall will determine what factors intrude. We would probably prefer to look at this from a systems-based perspective, because it's a bit tighter in respect of how well you can resolve down what's really going on. But from my understanding of the way that the question has been phrased, I would suggest it's actually quite simple, paradoxically, rather than the complexity that appears to be present. Insofar as, yes, anything negative that affects the anima complex, including the mother complex, will affect your relating. he seems to be suggesting in that quote that you can model relating more efficiently to overcome that if you consider other relationships. You mentioned the beloved, I believe, James, in that quotation. Well, that can be just simply something that you acquire through ongoing experience of relating to women on the outside. But remember, of course, that the fact that we're talking about females here, whether it's the mother or a beloved in the outer world, is still projection of the relating function. The relating function fundamentally is separate to anything it may be projected onto. So just think of it as being gender neutral. It's just a function. So you can choose, if you like, consciously, when you're aware of what you're doing, to allow a complex like the mother complex to continue to interfere with that, even if earlier in life it was in some sense a determinant of how it's been shaped. You can choose, once you become conscious, to disentangle yourself from its effects. And it's the same with people that we meet in the outside world. We're socially modelling, socially learning all the time through our persona, if you like, in a Jungian sense, as a continual updating and interaction of our persona and of our external relating. We tend, however, though, to neglect the internal relating. We leave that generally to complexes, and if the mother complex has been undeveloped or unchallenged, then that can run rampant on the inside. So very often the way that we relate to the inner world is more decisive, perhaps paradoxically, than the influences we've had on the outside overall. So I would suggest that you begin to disentangle yourself, if it's you that you're talking about in this instance, from the effects of the mother complex negatively on the inside. You can do that by becoming conscious. It's really fairly simple, except of course that the process in and of itself can be less than simple. It can be quite difficult and quite emotional, but the actual thing that you have to go through in terms of defining it is simple. Disentangle from the negative influences on the inside and then interact positively on the outside. That way you'll refine your relating function properly. You can't do that though if you're not conscious of the negative effects that are operating internally, and they're the ones that we tend to neglect. Even in introverts, they're surrounded by it. If you're introverted, you're surrounded by this stuff all the time, but you're still not fully conscious of it. You're just surrounded by it. Whereas extroverts tend to move away from it and neglect it that way by working in the outer world. And all that happens then is that you can set up a polarity of inner and outer, and they're in conflict, and that conflict is felt by the individual personality as it struggles to adapt. So in both cases I'd suggest disentangle from the inner image and then readapt externally. And then as your persona updates itself to where you're at now, you will update in effect your functional personality, which is your adaptation in the moment. So that's what I would say on that. How about you, Love?
It's hard to know which perspective to come at that from, because obviously this is a man's psychology, isn't it, as opposed to a woman's. I guess so in terms of the relating function, I think you're right. You've got to be able to define those inner characteristics so as you know what you're up against on the inside.
Yes.
Because if you don't do that, then it will slip into just about everything you do.
Yes.
And we've talked recently about the way the negative anima and the negative animus works in terms of occupying a person's dominant function.
That's true.
So you've got to it's useful, I think, to try and catch it in action if you possibly can, because that's where it's operating. That's where it's operating in the outer world usually too. And this is it. It's actually a very active process, isn't it? Uncovering complexes.
It is.
And dismantling them or transforming them and liberating the energy that they acquire. And you really do need to have that cast of mind, I think, where you decide that you're kind of going to go for it. And you're going to observe yourself in a way that maybe you've never observed yourself before, and also that you're open to feedback from other people, from people that you trust. If you have a kind of a trusted circle of people who aren't out to hurt or harm you in some way, to see if they catch it in action. So I think there's a lot of very practical things you
Absolutely.
can do in order to chase this thing down. And when you do, you might surprise yourself. It might be, good grief, yes, I didn't realise I was doing that or doing that thing in that way, and suddenly you have a light bulb moment. It's a moment of consciousness, and if you do that, if you're prepared to go in and be forensic about it, you'll be surprised just how much you can sort these things out.
Yeah. And there you have it, theory and practice. The best possible combination.
Definitely. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate you. And we move on to the next question, which comes from the bewildered one. Not quite sure why he's so bewildered, because his question is quite articulate. But here we go.
He's bewildered. He's
Yes,
got a very
very sharp.
very incisive
Yes.
mind.
Yeah.
Indeed. So, bewildered one begins with a quote from On Jung by Anthony Stevens, and it goes as such. So good parents are those who actualize enough of the parental archetypes for us to complete the business of childhood and move on to the next stage of life. But what they leave unactualized persists as unconscious potential, which will continue to seek fulfillment as individuation proceeds. The less adequate the parents, the greater the unfulfilled potential, the more ravenous the parent hunger, and the more obsessive the Flying Dutchman quest. Generally speaking, wrote Jung, all the life the parent could have lived, but of which they thwarted themselves for artificial motives, is passed on to the children in substitute form. That is to say, the children are driven unconsciously in the direction intended to compensate for everything that was left unfulfilled in the lives of the parents. And then the bewildered one goes on and says, I understand the Flying Dutchman quest as a seeking of redemption, but misfiring from one dependent relationship to another. But is Jung suggesting here that the shadow of the parents, the unconscious instincts unfulfilled through lifespan development and lack of alignment with the self, transfers to the child? In essence, does the child pay for the sins of the parents' lack of individuation? What would the biological implications for this be, if so? What do you think?
Biologically, well, specifically biologically, you'll know this as a biologist yourself, James, that there are usually benefits from things which don't appear to be beneficial at all. So I would suggest then that the biological advantage is that it creates variation in attempts at correcting for things. So although it's not optimal and it does cause problems, then there will be people who will either stumble into a new adaptation by accident, or who will develop themselves consciously to the point where they generate new strategies and new adaptations. And actually, if you look at how the history of psychotherapy, even modern psychology as such, has unfolded, it's generally the history of people who realised they were neurotic and maladapted and had to come up with some kind of strategy to deal with that, and along the way developed a general theory which could be of use to other people. So you can see then in the social product of psychotherapy in the various schools several different attempts at overcoming what is essentially that specific problem that's been highlighted by Nick. So on a biological and therefore a cultural scale, bearing in mind that the two interact, it's not just nature, it's not just nurture, it's the interaction of those two nuances between those polarities. You can get an example, perhaps even an exemplary example as such, in the history of psychotherapy. Jung himself said that his own model was an attempt basically to understand himself, and that he believed the same was true of Freud and of Adler. So I think, yeah, in a general sense, and as we go through personal development, that's what we're trying to do. Most of us, we're trying to understand what's happened to us in terms of our maladaptations. In some people, that will generate a neurosis that doesn't produce anything other than a distressed life. In others, there will still be suffering, but they will make an attempt to change. And a proportion of them will be people who will provide a way out for other people from their own experience of maladaptation. So yeah, I think biologically and therefore culturally there will be some advantages to that. What do you think, Paul, in general terms?
I'd probably have a couple of practical comments to make on that. One would be that at one level, as parents, you do actually only have to be good enough to raise a child from birth to adulthood in terms of what you provide for them. And it depends on the starting point of the parent, and it depends on the starting point of the child. So in other words, to come back to biology, the hand that you dealt genomically, and it might be that actually the parents don't have a great deal of potential at all, except in so much as they can maybe provide the most basic things for that child or for their children in order to get from birth to adulthood. It may be too that you children, it could even be that your children have less potential than you do. There are a whole number of permutations, aren't there, that go on here. So it just depends what your starting point is. But I certainly think if you have parents who are and I think it's implicit maybe in what you're saying, that maybe did have potential that they didn't fulfill, and that you can look back and you can see that to some extent the children of those parents or the child of those parents will be burdened by that. Children do typically tend to live out the unlived lives of their parents, and it's not always in a positive direction either. There's probably all sorts of examples that you could give for that. The vicar's son who becomes the criminal, or whatever. We could give a whole host of examples. So I really do just think it depends on what the starting point of the parents is and what the starting point of the child is as well, and like you said, that's something that is innate, that's dictated at birth, and so everybody's context is very individual. But certainly with respect to Nick, it's quite clear that he has a huge amount of potential. And that whatever hand he was dealt in terms of his parents, he's more than compensating for that now, and very positively, I might add.
Absolutely.
Yes. So that's probably what I'd have to say on
that. Well, we know Nick quite well.
We do. So
we can make that positive statement with great confidence on the basis of that we do know him well.
Yes.
I just to add to what you two were saying, just a little extra thing, because as I keep talking to guys on consultations over on the Patreon, the more I learn and the more patterns I get to sort of pick up. And as we've been talking about the personal myth, obviously it's important to go back into the past and see the hand that you were dealt and see the reality of things. But there does tend to be a thread through some of the people I talk to, which is more of it goes towards a very strong focus on the past, to the point where you almost get lost in the personal myth. And it's like, I can understand that, especially if you're more introverted. But no matter what the hand you were dealt, it's useful to go back and process the wound. But the point is the future, and will have to be the future. So especially in that first question, it's like, well, about a negative mother complex. And obviously, we don't know the details, but for most people, a negative mother complex can be overcome through relating to an outside woman, and that's the future. That's moving forward. So it's like, if you're living out the unactualized potential through the parents, it's like, well, focus on who you want to be, the energy that calls you into the future, especially if there's no massive amount of suffering involved, I would say. Just be my 2 cents on that. Yeah, you have to know you're doing it, don't you? This is the problem with all things. If there's no awareness, no consciousness that is indeed what you're doing, that you can't correct for it. No. And you don't choose the hand that you dealt, you don't choose the parents that you get, and some people get a very bad deal. If I think back even to my own situation, I probably wouldn't have chosen my parents. Obviously you like to believe as parents that you'll do a better job yourself when your turn comes, but you can't know whether that's right for the children that you get. It's all of these things are uncertain, and so we all just have to adjust to the hand that we've been dealt in whatever way is best. And I think you're right, James. I think the focus has to be on the future rather than the maladaptations of the past. There's nothing to be gained by that once you've actually acquired the necessary insights, and then it's time for action. It's time to implement the necessary changes in the world. And
you know, if you haven't got what you need from your own parents for whatever reason, then you can still dip into the archetypes. You can still find other relationships in the outside world that will allow you to engage in a way that maybe that you couldn't with your own parents. So you can still access all of these things. You just have to usually do it in other ways.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Can I just add something there, Nick, if that's okay? Sorry, yes, James and Nick. This idea of going back into the past, those who are familiar with the introductory level of the personal myth, as I've suggested it through the Discord, yes, absolutely. The whole point of going back is not to stand still. It's just to give yourself an impression consciously of what may be the subtext of your life that's been running all along. It is not to regress or to infantilize you. Going back will allow you to reconstellate previous ego states, previous ego states, because the level of consciousness that you may have had at the age of 5 is different to that which you may have it will be at any age pretty much in the future from that. If you go back in a particular way, and there are techniques of doing this, you can reconstruct a level of consciousness which matches that of the past. The dangers inherent in that, though, are that, of course, false memory, recovered memory, that kind of thing, but also, as I said, infantilizing yourself by becoming like that. Your whole world will shrink if you do that. So the real purpose of going back is to find other things that are concealed by the negative memories, the essentials of yourself, which are positive and which were forward looking, that may have become lost in the through line of your life. This is why we're completely different from so-called inner child therapy, for example, which is a totally different thing and something that we would not support.
No, not at all.
Also why it's completely different from the kind of manufactured artificial construct that, say, a traditional analytic transference would create, which does infantilize, particularly if it has a Freudian emphasis, but a Jungian one can do this as well. It's completely different from that. You go back in order to find yourself as in what that part of yourself expected, wanted, anticipated, and pushed you towards achieving in the future. So when you find that difference, you've got a definition of the mismatch between your potential and what you've actualized up until this point. It's not to go back and stay there. It's not to go back and to infantilize yourself. So just to clear that up, obviously that needs an awful lot more explication because there's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
But you don't go back for any other reason than to find the point at which you lost your way. And also uncover the potential which your genome knew and still knows is latent within you, and why you're under pressure from your instincts and your genome as a whole right now. That's why you feel stressed if you're feeling those kinds of pressures, because you're expected by your genome to release your potential, not to become a child again when you're an adult. Definitely not. That's dangerous. Don't do it. So just to clear that up.
Yes. And if you can't access that potential through relationship to your own parents, then you can do it in other ways, through other men and women who are out there. There are many mothers and there are many fathers out there, and many ways and styles of doing things. And that's why, for example, you know, say in Chinese traditions, they're very much plugged into that, into the idea of a family. Or, you know, it might be that this is why young men go into the services, because again, they're looking for an alternative family, or they were looking for some kind of mentorship from other adults. So there are still many ways of accessing these things, even if you've been dealt a bad hand.
In the Chinese tradition, they have a saying, for example, a teacher for a day is a father for life. If in a traditional Chinese culture, if you're accepted as a pupil in whatever discipline that might be, by a father figure, and they openly call him father,
they do,
you know, then that's it for life at that point. If you're errant, of course, as a pupil, then there are sanctions built into that. But the implication from both sides of that equation, that socio-cultural equation, are the same, which is that if you commit to a second, third or fourth father in whatever area that is, then there's a reciprocal commitment to you. And even Confucius, from a slightly different background with respect to Chinese tradition, said 1 in 3 is a teacher. So you're going to find these other fathers, these other mothers all over the place if you but look. But pick the right one. If you pick the wrong one, then the outcome's not going to be very nice at all.
All right, thank you, Nigel, for your question. Really appreciate that, as always. The next one comes from Mountain Sheffer. And Mountain Sheffer says, hello, I'm new here. I want to start by thanking Steve, Pauline and James for creating this community and all the great videos and pamphlets, etc. I also want to thank all the members of the community who are so interesting and informative. I've learned a lot just reading what's already here, especially in the library section. This is already beginning to feel like an essay, so sorry in advance. Lol. I have some questions about Steve and Pauline's individuation marriage. First of all, can anyone have one, or do you need to be depth psychologists? Is it simply 2 people who are married and supporting each other's individuation, or do you individuate as a couple as well? In the shadow integration video and the handout, you talked about how there can be a shadow at any level of collectivity. Does that mean you would do shadow work on your shared shadow? If so, would you also have a shared personal myth, and so on? All of this brings me to the question I think I really want to ask, which is, do you think you could have other kinds of individuation relationships? Like, if several people want to go into business together, would they be able to, or even benefit from, having an individuation business, or team, or friendship, or society, etc.? If so, do you have any thoughts on how to go about doing so? Those are really good thoughts, actually. I'm interested to hear the answer to
Very
this.
interesting question, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think they're all possible.
Yes.
They're all possible. Obviously, we didn't start out married. You know, that followed after an appropriate period of time. Although, to be honest, I would have married her immediately, but she was too young, and we had to get past her parents, who were obstructive, to say the least.
Yes.
That's another story.
Yeah.
But yeah, any relationship can be an individuation one, but we didn't know how it would end up. It's like an a priori thing to the goal. You know, I think if you to enter a relationship of this kind and say, I want this to be an individuation relationship, that is like a business transaction, whereas it's a process. It was a process, and I was very lucky, extremely lucky. I hope she was too. I don't know. I have to ask her. Lucky in the sense that we worked it through, but we had to suffer. We had to suffer a great deal.
Yeah.
To disentangle the crap that we'd both acquired up until that point in our lives, and then as we adjusted to being together, and we still do, and yes, a relationship will have its own shadow and will have its own myth. You could resolve that down to the level, for example, to talk about complexes, of a family complex, which Jung discovered and proved that these things existed when he did his psychophysiological stress testing and word association tests with families. And you can get the original material with all the results from that in volume 2 of his collected works, Experimental Researches. So families, relationships do share a psychological environment. They do have a common set of beliefs. It's an emergent process from whatever is in, if it's a couple, it's in a relationship from what's within both of you, and then whether you make a decision to develop that or not. It's entirely possible to know nothing about Jungian depth psychology and to have an individuation marriage. Entirely possible. You don't need to know anything about that. It's just a process that unfolds through a genuine attempt at relating, which is another reason why I don't prefer, under ordinary conditions, unless it's theoretical ones, to talk about the anima and the animus, only the relating function, because pretty much most people get that, unless they've had Jung stuffed between their ears, and then everything they hear has to be filtered through this model. But real people don't know about these things, but they still relate. And there's still that natural understanding that if you find someone, whether it's the same sex or opposite sex or whatever sex, you know, that if you relate to that person through your relating function and that's reciprocal, and then there's a commitment, you will get somewhere with that. If though you mean specifically Jungian, Well, Carl Jung's been a feature, or his model has been a feature of our life together for 42 years, right from the get-go. In fact, from just before, because before we were actually together, I would trail man and his symbols in front of 16-year-old Pauline, and try and impress her with it and say, look, this is the path we can go on. And I'd scare her of a few stories about out-of-body experiences and active imaginations and meditations and so forth. And it didn't put her off. So you could say that was shit testing in a way. I was testing to see whether that would put her off or she would want to join the journey, and she did, fortunately, because it's enhanced and enriched my life, and I would never have been without that. So yeah, you can have it within a relationship. You could have it within a corporate body, an organisation, and people do have values within an organisation. They do aspire to those values. The difficulty, though, is that an organisation is made up of individuals, and people bring their individual psyche to a group just as they do to a dyadic relationship like this, a two-person relationship. And a group is a system that self-regulates within tolerances that are agreed upon. If, however, those tolerances break down because one or more of the component members of that system has issues that are being influenced either outside of that system or internally to them, then that will break down, or it will readjust to another set of tolerances. So you can have, for example, a religion, without being too specific, that on the surface has very good intentions and regulates and contains people that go through it, but it's people going through it. And then you get deviations, shall we say, from what the ideal of that organisation, that religion should be, and then the system will adjust to contain them, perhaps even conceal them, as in, let's be honest, the kind of things that go on in the sense of exploiting and abusing children within the Christian church. It's the complete shadow of what they say they are, but it's people, and it's instincts, and it's the perversion of instincts, and it's the expression of power. All of those things go on. So the system of an organisation has to be very, very tight, or has to be very, very loose, and it has to, in the latter case, want to contain the integrity of the appearance of the system beyond the actual substance of that system. So it will self-regulate to contain its darker side. So it will be harder with a group. Not impossible. You can be in any kind of relationship to individuate, and you can do it on your own. It is possible, but that is exceptional because we're meant to be social. We're meant to interact. We're meant to live out our genome and actualize. Relating, reproduction, personal developments, all of these things are within us, and we are pushed to a greater or lesser degree or a greater or lesser extent, all of us individually. And out of that chaos, some kind of order emerges, which is the life of an individual in their context. So yeah, I think it's entirely possible. Well, what are you going to say now? Our relationship.
It's what to add to that, isn't it, really?
Well, you could say it was I was so disappointed. I had no idea I was going to be led into all this crap, and I thought you were this wonderful heroic policeman, and it turns out you were into all sorts of weird stuff, and you probably hypnotised me without me knowing it, and that's why I'm with you, and I could have done so much better in my life. How about that? Is that a possibility? Don't answer.
Well, what I was going to
say... Take your time, why don't you? Go on, take your time. Yeah, what were you going to say?
Well, we were both very young, obviously.
Yeah.
Me particularly.
Yeah, you
at
particularly.
The get-go.
Yeah, at the get-go. Yeah.
And we had an awful lot of opposition.
We did.
Didn't we?
Yeah.
Which in some ways was grist to the mill.
It is.
In some ways.
Yeah.
Because if you feel that you've got something special, then you protect it at all costs.
You do, yeah.
And we were saying recently, actually, because obviously when we got together, there were very different times to the times that people live in now.
Yeah.
And there weren't all the distractions of the internet
No.
and so on, and people sitting, texting one another rather than talking to one another. So one of the things that's always persisted, I think, for us right from the very start was conversation.
Yeah.
And it's something we've always done and continue to do. And before lockdown, then we had this thing of regularly going somewhere, doesn't really matter where, some kind of social situation, and we would just talk. And we've always talked. And I think because she was that little bit older than me, then you said this yesterday, actually, in the podcast we did yesterday, that sometimes in relationships, one person has to take the lead. And I think because you were a little bit older and a bit more experienced, and you'd read more, then that person was you.
To start with,
So somebody has to do that.
They do.
But then I guess I was receptive.
You were.
To that and to those ideas. So it wasn't as if you, that wasn't a turn off at all. Quite the opposite. So there are just some things which have been pivotal, I think, to our lives, and which have sustained us through all sorts of difficulties. And I think they have been, in broad terms, the capacity to talk and to talk around things, and we're probably each other's biggest critics, aren't we? Really?
Yeah, definitely.
We're not. You can't be a snowflake in our household.
No,
it wouldn't last very long. So we've had to be open to that.
Yeah, we have. That's part of that development, isn't it? Because we see each other's shadows.
Yes, we do.
And we see each other's anima and animus. We see them, we experience them.
Yes.
And how that triggers things off in us, and then also it helps you to regulate your own responses to that reflexively, so you grow on the inside. And that's still there, day in and day out. She analyses my dreams, I analyse hers, and my moods, and vice versa, and the waveform of my life. So if it didn't have that, I'd have run aground probably, or I'd have probably ended up going off in some weird direction. So I did need that.
You've got to want to do it. And it's not for everyone. And some people, I think, like you were saying, Steve, you could argue just do it naturally without calling it that.
They do.
Or without having those concepts to hand. They just manage as a system to kind of regulate one another and to learn from one another and to adapt and to develop themselves. So I think it's so long as you want that, then that's something that's open to anyone and everyone. Just to sort of thinking about the second part of the question, which was to do with organisations and working life too. One thing I think we have done in our lives away from this is to some extent to try and carry that over. I don't mean to impose it on people, but in terms of the working relationships we have, we do try and, I guess, be mindful of the fact that if we ask somebody to do something, that they do it in such a way that it develops them. So whether we're working with an artist or an actor or a director or whoever, that in terms of their involvement, that they benefit in some way from the overall process. So it does leak over into that. To some extent as well, doesn't it? And I think that's been a positive thing.
You can be aiming for individuation, but still be socially adapted, which is important. So it's not individualism. Jung himself said that. And I guess the more content you are with your own tolerances and your own boundaries, and the more accepting you are of yourself, the more likely you are to be accepting of difference in others, and seeing variation in other people as being valid. And again, in the clinical sense, that's so important, because you meet so many people, and they're all so different, and they'll have completely different views. If you don't feel secure in yourself, you'll probably go on the attack rather than allow people, the dignity, the respect for being different. In that pluralistic sense.
It's important too to not try and convert people.
Oh, absolutely.
Who are on a completely different path to you, but nonetheless are happy and adapted. And I think in terms of social engagement too, that's important, because it could be any encounter, couldn't it, in the most ordinary of circumstances, and whatever interaction that you have with that person has to be respected. I don't think you should be looking to ferret things out all the time.
No.
I mean, sometimes people accuse us of this, don't they, that we must have our sort of psychotherapy heads on all the time. And no is the answer to that.
You'd be worn out very quickly if you did that.
You would. It's better to just engage with people and engage with life and take people as you find them, and if something helpful happens along the way, that's great. But if not, that's fine too. So
it's all about context, isn't it?
It is, definitely.
If we're in context for that kind or this kind of work, then we do it, and we do it with 100% of our soul.
I would agree.
And we're fully engaged, but we don't carry that over. If it's inappropriate, it's not there.
No.
That's probably the best bet. But within our own relationship, then I wouldn't trust anybody else to supervise my work or my own development other than Pauline, and not because she's nice about it, which people do think. We've actually had that from within this profession. They think that it's the easy option. It isn't, because no one could track me down and corner me more efficiently than Pauline. They just couldn't get near me, but she can. And I hope vice versa.
Yes,
and
of course.
that's what it means to relate. You have an objectivity then within a relationship, which is not a separateness, it's a continuum between the two of you. You're part of a bandwidth of life. So that helps me enormously. It means I can trust her when she says I'm doing something wrong or I need to adjust, because there isn't that second sort of agenda which is based on some kind of hostility or whatever, because I know she's worked herself through and out, and it won't be being said for those purposes. It'll be like, you really do need to look at this, or have you considered that, or whatever. So I can trust that to be clean. You do have to trust that when you work in depth with someone, because you don't know, when you're working with someone, you don't know about them, you don't know about the life and the background. What are they bringing through? When they start to interpret your life and your situation, what's there that's in their life? What are the secondary gains coming from that relationship, and so forth? So you have to be careful. Hope that didn't stray too far from the question, James.
That's very sweet and very honest, and I think it's noble of you to open up and share that kind of stuff. As you say, which is the key takeaway, anyone can do it, but there is some of the guys watching, for example, you might be the only one in your relationship who's into this kind of thing. And it doesn't mean, you have to sit and have a Jung To Live By marathon every day. But, that might help. But no, it's simply a case of bring them on the same path. And as you say, you don't have to put Jungian nomenclature into things. It's simply, what are each other's shadows in colloquial terms? Where is everyone else's energy going? Why are they upset? That type of thing, rather than sort of coexisting or doing what you think one should do in a relationship. That's a really common one, especially in the generation above myself. So I guess with you two, it's man does X, woman does Y. And it's like, well, those energies, they do seem to flow naturally, but also there is a case of relating to the other person. And that is something, looking at, say, friends, extended families, people just I know, that's a rare thing to see. That's a very rare thing to see. It is a case of coexisting. So, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. You need to learn from the other person as well. And I think I've disclosed this before, because I was older. It wasn't that much older, but I was a police officer.
Well, you had enough of a head start.
I had quite a head start, and in terms of depth psychology, I had a head start. So it's seeing potential. That's the thing I saw in her. I intuited terrific potential, latency, because it was suppressed within the family that she was in, but nevertheless the potential that was there, and not potential to be shaped, but potential to live, and therefore something I could benefit from. But then it takes time, and then after a while you have to say, I have to set myself aside here, because I've been leading from the front. I'm going to have to stand alongside this lady now, or even slip in behind, metaphorically, and allow her to lead in order I can progress with my developments. And that's what it will be like.
With that, I think we should probably close up the show today. That's all right?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Thank
James.
you. Thanks, everyone. Blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone watching. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question. If you would like to join in with our roundtable that we do here every so often, it seems to be at random times at this point, just get through all the questions that we possibly have. We've got about 20 in the pipeline right now. Then you can do so by signing up at the $10 tier or higher on Patreon. Of course, we really appreciate that, if indeed you've got a question that you want answered. So with that, thank you everybody. Thanks, Steve, Pauline.
Thank you,
Thanks,
James.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.